I think the third instance of it now will reinforce in voters' minds that sense of one rule for us and one rule for
Yes.
them. And that, of course, has proven toxic to the
Yes.
Conservatives, because that's exactly what Partygate said to people. It was they're celebrating whilst they told us to stay at home. We missed, funerals, weddings, whilst they have parties. I think this betting on the election date being perceived to have some kind of insider knowledge to get a financial advantage will trigger exactly the same buttons
Yes.
that Partygate triggered with people. And I wouldn't be surprised if in next week's focus groups we start seeing it cut through.
Yeah. It's time to talk about the opinion polls with Luke Tryl from the polling company More in Common, as we do each week at this time. Welcome to you, Luke.
Good evening.
It's good to see you. So, look, I mean, you've got a new poll. Let's start with that, shall we? Which is it's out, published in 15 minutes' time. You can give us a bit of a sneak preview. What do you have?
I can. So this is our latest national voting intention poll, and we find the Conservatives steady on 25%, Labour on 39%, down 2 from the last poll. It's the first time we've had them drop below 40, but change within the margin of error. The Lib Dems on 11, Reform on 14, equal to their share earlier in the week, and the Greens on 5.
Right.
So that overall is a Labour lead over the Conservatives of 14 points. Still a very big lead, but I should say perhaps one of the narrower leads that we've seen over the campaign, and does seem to follow a trend with some pollsters we're seeing of that Labour vote just ticking down a little bit. Still a big lead, but we also had a YouGov poll, which was just out about half an hour ago, that had Labour down on 36%,
Yes.
the Tories on 20%, and Reform on 18%. So it was interesting there that there's 2 polls out today which showed the Labour vote share ticking down, even though they still have a big lead over the Conservatives.
So, and what are we to make of that? If the Labour lead is being squeezed a little bit, the Conservatives don't seem to be picking up anything very measurable. We're talking about reform. How's it moving?
It's difficult to know. So one thing that could be happening is that in the south, in some of those seats where the Lib Dems are the main challengers, there may be more tactical voting going on. People have realised that the Liberal Democrats are the main opposition in some seats, and that would bolster them. But then
Is that being reflected? Are we seeing the Lib Dem vote tick up?
So certainly you have in UCOV, you've seen a higher Liberal Democrat share. We have them at 11, which is actually amongst the highest that they have been. So that could well be part of it. But also as well, underneath the surface, yes, there are Conservative votes going to Reform UK. But there could be some Labour votes going as well, maybe a smaller number. We'd have to look under the bonnet of that a bit more. But it also might be a bit of a merry-go-round, which is happening. So some more Conservative votes are going to Reform,
right,
and some more Labour votes are going back to the Conservatives, or some of the undecideds are splitting. So it's difficult to say with such small numbers, but it is interesting that there seems to be a sustained trend of Labour being down from those highs of 45, 44 at the start of the campaign, and to the low 40s or even below now across most of the pollsters.
Right, okay. Which brings me to the polls that we've been seeing this week, especially yesterday, when we had those really, really remarkable, a set of 3, wasn't it? MRP, seat by seat, ultra detailed opinion polls, which sort of bear out the narrative that we're getting onto now, which is, the Labour lead, it's looking strong, maybe a bit of corrosion going on there too. But you look at the bigger polls, and Labour still in a colossal position of dominance.
Oh, absolutely. And what was striking about those 3 MRP polls, as we call them, which allow you to do individual seat projections, because they have larger samples, and you take people's demographics and characteristics, and you can project them onto different seats to see how they might vote. What was interesting is not only were all 3 of them projecting pretty much the worst result in the Conservative Party's history, all of them also pointed to deterioration in the Conservative seat share. So in More in Commons MRP, we were down from 180 to 155. YouGov's down from around 140 to 108. So things having actually got worse during the campaign as well. And I think both of those things are quite striking. We are heading, it seems, one way or the other for a historic general election
Yeah,
result,
yeah.
and the Conservatives are the losers from that.
And such other quirks of this election campaign, the way votes are distributed, is mattering as much or more than shares of support for different parties. You're looking at Labour, maybe at the kind of share of support that Theresa May got when she was run so close in 2017, and then looking maybe at a whopping majority. To people looking at it from outside, they say, "What on earth is going on here?"
Well, I think there are two things which are varying. One is, yes, Labour's vote share might well be lower than what Theresa May got, but their lead above the Conservatives, and that's what matters, is significantly higher and higher than Blair had in 1997. But there's a second factor as well, which is what type of swing are we going to see in the general election? So there's the sort of traditional uniform national swing. So that is, you sort of take 4% off everyone if there's a 4% swing against. But it looks like the swing this time might be slightly more proportional. And what does that mean? That means that the Tories lose more votes in seats they did better in last time and fewer in seats that they lost. So the impact of that is previously safe seats start falling,
Yes.
and Labour gain more seats than they would on a straight uniform swing. And it does look like there's some evidence of proportionality in the swing this time. And that is really bad news for the Conservatives, because it puts those heartland Tory shire seats really at risk.
Yeah, I mean, look, the big story we've been covering today that you'll have seen is the story about the alleged betting scandal. In its way, an absolutely extraordinary story. The investigations are still going on. We still see who, in the end, ends up being accused of. Well, we don't know that yet, but as it stands, it's an extraordinary story. Caused an enraged reaction among Conservatives. Tim Montgomery, who you know, has been telling me that some of his friends in the party have resigned over this story today. You have to wonder what sort of impact that can have, given that support for the Tories is already so remarkably low.
It's really interesting. So we spent this week doing focus groups on the northeast coast. So we're in Hartlepool, Blythe, Whitby, and then moved a bit further inland to Rishi's seat in Richmond. And the really interesting thing was the gambling story hadn't yet cut through. What we would hear a lot of was D-Day still from the but we'd also hear about the Sky issue. Rishi Sunak saying that a sign of something he'd missed out on was not having Sky.
That sank in.
I was really surprised with the number of people who brought up what they saw as Rishi making that gaffe on Sky, reinforcing perceptions of him being out of touch, but not the gambling thing. But I think now
that story's still developing.
Exactly, and I think now we have a third instance, it looks like, of or certainly a third instance of the gambling and the betting on the election date being under investigation. I think it is more likely to cut through, because just one, and it's quite a complicated story. It's not as easy to get as D-Day or Sky. You've got to sort of be paying attention. But I think the third instance of it now will reinforce in voters' minds that sense of one rule for us and one rule for them. And that, of course, has proven toxic to the Conservatives, because that's exactly what Partygate said to people. It was, they're celebrating whilst they told us to stay at home. We missed, funerals, weddings, whilst they had parties. I think this betting on the election date being perceived to have some kind of insider knowledge to get a financial advantage will trigger exactly the same buttons that Partygate triggered with people. And I wouldn't be surprised if in next week's focus groups we start seeing it cut through.
Yeah. I'm going to stress again that we're talking about allegations here, and in inquiries, not proven proof or guilt of wrongdoing, but the impact has been just so far really quite remarkable. Now, you've been doing regularly these things called focus groups, and I find them very fascinating, because they're basically conversations with a selection of voters, a representative selection of voters, where you talk through the issues of the day. And that way you get a bit of an insight, because you choose your participants carefully and you listen to them very carefully. You get an idea of what's going on behind voters' eyes at a particular point. So should we talk about your latest work on focus groups? And well, tell me, over to you then, tell me more, your focus groups, what's really leapt out for you and what you've been doing in here?
Yeah. So the reason that we do these focus groups is that they give you what polls can't. Polls can tell you what people are thinking. What the focus groups tell you is why people are thinking it. And we've done around 40 since the start of the campaign, all around the country, with some quite common themes jumping out. So what I found interesting this week was we did some very different areas. We did down in Aldershot, up in Blyth and Hartlepool, as I said, over in Wells. My team were also there. And the interesting thing was people wanted to talk about Nigel Farage. There was what we were getting from swing voters was a sense of Nigel Farage. I might not vote for him. I don't quite like some of what he stands for, but he says it like it is, doesn't he? He says things other politicians aren't willing to say, and we need that. And I think if obviously the Conservatives are very worried about Nigel Farage and his impact, but I actually think it's also starting to pose potentially a challenge to Labour as well, because we found you get that sentiment, particularly amongst those who voted Labour in 2017, Tory in 2019, and have now gone back for now to the Labour Party. They seem to, like Nigel Farage, he seems to have a particular appeal to that group. They don't have their traditional loyalty to the Labour Party that they had previously. And whilst I don't think it affects them now, I think if Nigel Farage wins in Clacton, he will quickly switch from being a thorn in the Conservative side to a problem for a potential Labour government.
Yeah. But you say you don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference now. If he's cutting through and it's coming up in these conversations around your focus group tables, it could still have an effect on the numbers. I mean, how strongly are you feeling that Nigel Farage still has it in him to be, well, to some degree, a bit of a game changer?
Well, I certainly think he's a game changer for the Conservatives because I think he's preventing some of that narrowing. He keeps that gap wide. For Labour, I think there are two reasons why it will have a limited impact on them in the run-up to this election. One is the time for change mood is so strong, and you get lots of people saying, oh, but he never actually gets in, does he? He always runs, he never wins, and that is certainly because we say some people will see it as a wasted vote when they just want the Conservatives out as well. But I think secondly, the swing to Labour across the country is so great, it's difficult to see it having an impact. But if he's elected, if he's in Parliament, I think it's going to be more challenging for Labour if they do get, if the polls are right. And why is that? Because I think had they beaten the Conservatives, it's normal for an opposition party's brand to take a bit of time to recover. And we know from the focus groups and from the polling that the Conservative Party brand is at a low, and it would have taken time, and Labour would have had a bit of a honeymoon. But now you've potentially got this second opposition party entering on the right, who could become an outlet for disaffection with Labour quite quickly. And there's a world in which we're talking in a year or two's time hence when Labour have a similar problem to the Conservatives in the sense that they are losing votes to the Greens on their left flank, but also facing a challenge in some of the red wall seats we expect them to gain on the right.
Now, are you picking up indications that the growing line, the growing chorus of Conservatives telling us, look, don't let Labour have too big a win, which sounds defeatist, which sounds faithless, but are you getting any indication that may actually be working in some way?
I think it might be. It doesn't work with those who've switched directly from Conservative to Labour. So it's not an election winning strategy. It doesn't get you in a first back. Where it does seem to be resonating is with those who voted Conservative in 2019, are basically culturally conservative, but are disgruntled and currently say they don't know. And what has struck me this week in focus groups is the number of people who have played back spontaneously, oh, I think the Conservatives deserve to lose. But I'm a bit worried about Labour having too big a majority, and bringing it up without me prompting on that question, which
and
I
saying
think
they're going back into the Conservative.
Well, they're
tent
still
as a
hovering.
Okay.
They're still hovering. So whether it pushes about. And the second thing with that group as well is that whilst we know across all voters, people basically think the Conservatives and Labour are equally likely to raise taxes, with Conservative to don't know voters, we found they're much more likely to think Labour will raise taxes.